In a small coastal village where the waves kissed the golden sands like a whispered promise, lived a young woman whose presence seemed to glow brighter than the sun at noon. Her name was Amara, a girl of gentle disposition and a heart so kind that even the most hardened villagers could not help but feel drawn to her warmth. From dawn till dusk, she moved through the village with a quiet grace, helping elders carry their heavy loads, tending to children with soft laughter, and mending torn clothes or broken baskets for anyone who needed her. Her wisdom was unmatched for one so young. She would offer counsel to those in turmoil, finding solutions that even the village elders sometimes overlooked. People often whispered that Amara seemed touched by something otherworldly, as though she could hear the thoughts of the sea or feel the whispers of the wind. Her eyes, dark and fathomless, held a depth that spoke of untold secrets, secrets that belonged neither entirely to her nor entirely to this world. Yet, in a place so steeped in tradition, kindness was often mistaken for weakness. While Amara's deeds brought joy and relief to many, they also stirred envy and resentment in those whose hearts were less pure. Among her own family, whispers of dissatisfaction and ambition simmered quietly, unnoticed by Amara, who trusted in the goodness of the people around her. Her father, once a man of pride and honor, had begun to covet the small fortune the family possessed, while her older siblings, each bearing their own grudges and jealousies, eyed her with suspicion. It was said that a family divided by greed would one day face a reckoning, yet no one foresaw that the reckoning would descend so suddenly, so brutally, and in such a manner that even the sea itself would bear witness. The village itself was a place of contradictions, at once vibrant and serene, yet shadowed by ancient superstitions that clung to every rock and ripple of the tide. The elders spoke often of the spirits of the sea, beings invisible to mortal eyes but omnipresent in their influence. They said that the sea could soothe the sorrowful, grant favors to the pure of heart, and exact vengeance upon those whose hearts were twisted by cruelty. Boats would not drift without permission from these unseen forces, and storms could rise as swiftly as a whispered curse. It was a world where every wave, every gust of wind, and every flicker of moonlight held significance, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural were so thin that one could scarcely tell where one ended and the other began. Amara had always been attuned to these signs. Even as a child, she would pause on the shore, feeling the rhythm of the waves and listening to the hushed murmur of the ocean as if it were speaking directly to her. The villagers, while respectful of the sea's power, often regarded her connection with a mixture of awe and unease. They could not comprehend how a mere girl could sense the moods of the waters, how she could predict tides and tempests with uncanny precision. And yet, in her presence, the restless waves seemed to calm, as though recognizing a kindred spirit in her heart. Despite her gifts and her gentle wisdom, shadows were gathering. Those who harbored jealousy and ill intent had begun to weave their schemes in silence, their plots masked by polite smiles and veiled concern. Amara, ever trusting, could not see the malice lurking in familiar faces, nor could she suspect the terrible lengths some would go to silence her light. The stage was set for a betrayal so chilling that even the legends whispered by the elders did not capture its horror. The ocean, ever watchful, sensed the impending injustice. In its depths, unseen currents stirred restlessly, as though aware that the balance of fate was about to be disrupted. Small signs appeared in subtle ways, fish swimming in unusual patterns near the shore, the wind carrying faint, sorrowful cries, and waves that seemed to recoil as if in warning. As Amara continued her quiet life, the tension in the village built imperceptibly, a dark thread weaving itself through the sunlit days. Her every act of kindness, every word of comfort, was shadowed by envy and suspicion. The coastal winds, which once carried laughter and the scent of salt and flowers, now whispered of hidden plots, of hearts hardened by greed and pride. There was a sense, unspoken yet palpable, that a reckoning loomed, a reckoning in which the sea would no longer remain passive. The villagers, steeped in tradition, knew that when human cruelty defied the natural order, the forces beyond the shore would respond in ways both terrifying and just. And so, even as Amara smiled and tended to her daily tasks, the ocean watched, the horizon stretching endlessly before her, pregnant with mystery and promise. The stage of fate was set, the currents of destiny were shifting, and the moment of unimaginable betrayal approached, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the first act to unfold. The sea, eternal and knowing, whispered its warning, a quiet prelude to the storm of consequences that would sweep through the lives of those who dared to betray the innocent. Before the shadow of betrayal touched her life, Amara's days were filled with the gentle rhythm of the village, a pattern of labor, laughter, and simple joys that reflected the harmony she brought to the lives of those around her. Each morning, as the sun cast its golden light across the sands and the salty air carried the cries of gulls and the hum of fishing boats, Amara rose before dawn. She would walk barefoot along the shoreline, feeling the cool water lap at her feet, her eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the day's changes. She greeted every villager with warmth, a nod here, a soft word of encouragement there, and her presence was like a balm to the weary. Mothers found her a gentle companion for their children, elders sought her counsel, and even the village's laborers paused in their toil to exchange a smile or brief conversation with her. Her hands, though delicate, were skilled and strong. She mended torn fishing nets, stitched tattered clothing, and carried water to households whose wells ran dry. She gathered herbs along the cliffs, knowing which could heal fevers and which could ease pain, and she shared them freely, asking nothing in return. Each act of service, though small in itself, wove her into the fabric of the village in ways that were profound yet often taken for granted. But it was not mere duty that guided her. It was a genuine empathy, a deep well of compassion that seemed to flow endlessly, spilling into every corner of her world. Amara also had dreams that stretched beyond the waves and the narrow lanes of her village. She longed to travel, to learn of distant lands and the people who lived there, to bring knowledge in new ways back to her own home. She imagined building a small school for the children, where stories could be told, lessons shared, and imagination allowed to flourish. She dreamed of connecting the villagers to the wider world, of showing them that kindness and curiosity could coexist with tradition and ritual. But these dreams were quiet ones, whispered to herself as she walked alone along the cliffs or as she watched the sun sink into the ocean, painting the sky with crimson and gold. Her relationships too were a source of strength and joy. Her younger brother, Tay, adored her and often sought her advice on matters big and small, while her childhood friend, Sephu, shared her love for the sea and often accompanied her on walks along the shore, their conversations a mix of playful teasing and serious reflection. There was also Kofi, a young fisherman whose eyes always lingered on Amara when he thought she wasn't looking. Their friendship was gentle, built on shared respect and unspoken understanding, though a quiet longing hovered just beneath the surface. Amara, wise beyond her years, sensed it but allowed the relationship to grow at its own pace, valuing patience over impulse. Despite the harmony that surrounded her, subtle tensions lingered in the corners of her world, unnoticed by Amara but observed by those whose hearts were less pure. Her family, though outwardly proud of her, harbored envy. Her father, once a man of unwavering fairness, had begun to view her popularity with unease, seeing in it a challenge to his authority. Her older sister Mara carried a simmering resentment, feeling overshadowed by Amara's natural charm and the admiration she received from the villagers. Even neighbors, who once sought her aid without hesitation, now cast glances tinged with suspicion or jealousy when she passed. They whispered in hushed tones about her beauty, her cleverness, and her ability to solve problems with ease, as if her gifts threatened to remind them of their own shortcomings. Yet Amara remained oblivious to the malice that lurked beneath polite smiles and hollow compliments. Her days were full of purposeful action, collecting firewood for a widow, guiding a child safely to school through the narrow paths between huts, or helping the fishermen sort and dry their catch under the hot sun. She spoke to the villagers with warmth, never judgment, and she never withheld her kindness from even the least deserving. It was this unshakable goodness, this unwavering empathy, that made the eventual betrayal so shattering. For Amara, trust was not given lightly, but once given, it was steadfast. And those who planned to harm her knew that they were exploiting her trust, taking advantage of a heart that saw only the best in others. The village itself was alive with color and sound in these peaceful days. Children ran along the sands with shrieks of laughter, weaving between fishing boats and market stalls. Women carried baskets of fruit and herbs on their heads, calling greetings to friends as they passed. Men hauled nets from the sea, their muscles glistening with sweat, and traders arrived from neighboring villages with goods that brought excitement and curiosity. The air was thick with the scent of salt, fish, and fragrant spices, and the horizon stretched endlessly, the waves reflecting the sky's every hue. In this world, Amara moved like a gentle current, touching everyone in small, meaningful ways. But even in these bright moments, shadows lingered. Gossip spread quietly through the village, a crooked glance here, a whispered rumor there. Some villagers questioned her motives, some envied her skills, and others, fearful of her perceived closeness to the spirits of the sea, looked upon her with suspicion. These tensions, subtle as the morning mist over the ocean, were invisible to Amara. She walked among them as she always had, unaware that envy, greed, and resentment were gathering like dark clouds on a distant horizon. She trusted her family, her friends, and her neighbors implicitly, believing in the inherent goodness of those around her. It was this trust, so natural and pure, that would one day make the betrayal cut deeper than any wound, leaving a scar not just on her body but on her spirit and soul. Even in the simplest moments, helping a fisherman mend his nets, sharing a meal with her brother, or walking with Kofi along the water's edge, there was an underlying tension she could not yet see. The villagers' admiration was not universal, and the envy simmering beneath polite smiles hinted at a future of darkness. And though the sun rose and set as it always had, and the waves lapped peacefully against the shore, the currents of fate were shifting, carrying with them a betrayal that would forever alter the course of Amara's life. The night was suffocating, a heavy darkness that pressed against Amara from every side as she was forced toward the shore. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, and the rhythmic crashing of waves against jagged rocks seemed louder, sharper, as if echoing the pulse of her own terror. Her footsteps stumbled over the sand, each grain a reminder of the treachery that had brought her here. The villagers who had once smiled warmly at her now wore expressions of cold determination, their hands guiding her with firm, unyielding grip toward the coffin waiting ominously by the edge of the water. It was a crude structure, heavy and uninviting, its dark wood splintered in places, as though it had been built with the weight of hatred itself. As she was lifted and positioned inside, Amara's mind raced in a torrent of disbelief and panic. The lid, rough and unwelcoming, was pressed down over her, sealing her in a small, suffocating space. The air was thick and stale, and the scent of the wood mingled with the saltiness of the sea breeze that barely reached her trapped form. She pounded against the walls, her nails scraping against the coarse timber, her voice muffled by the tight enclosure. "Why?" she screamed silently into the darkness, her thoughts a mix of confusion, betrayal, and despair. Her heart thudded violently against her ribs, each beat a reminder of the life she had fought to live and the injustice that sought to snuff it out. Tears stung her eyes, blurring the edges of the tiny coffin, and every sound from outside, the slap of waves against the shore, the hushed footsteps of her betrayers, seemed magnified, echoing like a taunt. As the coffin was carried to the water's edge, the waves lapped hungrily at the sand, restless and alive. The villagers who had orchestrated this cruel act lowered the wooden box carefully, ensuring it floated just beyond the reach of the breakers. Amara's fingers pressed against the cold interior, feeling the slight give of the wood as the coffin shifted on the rising tide. She could hear the cries of nocturnal birds overhead, their calls sharp and frantic, as though protesting the injustice unfolding below. The wind whistled through the rigging of nearby boats, carrying with it strange, haunting murmurs that seemed to speak directly to her heart. The sea, in all its vast, unknowable expanse, seemed almost conscious, aware of the cruelty being committed in its domain. The coffin rocked gently at first, a deceptive lull that made the water seem benign, almost welcoming. But soon the movement became more chaotic, the waves rising higher, lashing against the wood with growing insistence. The currents tugged at her prison, rolling it back and forth with terrifying force, and Amara felt the icy grip of water against the timber. Fear twisted her stomach into knots. Every jolt threatened to tip the coffin into a watery grave from which there would be no return. Her thoughts scattered, visions of her family, of the village, of all she had done for them, now tainted by their betrayal, while the relentless rhythm of the sea pressed in on her from all sides. The sense of hopelessness threatened to drown her spirit long before the waves could touch her flesh. And yet, amidst the terror, the sea began to show signs of something otherworldly. Small phosphorescent glows flickered beneath the water's surface, illuminating the dark depths with an ethereal light that pulsed in rhythm with her panicked heartbeat. Strange shapes moved just below, too fluid to be fish, too deliberate to be anything ordinary, as if unseen spirits had gathered to watch over her plight. The wind carried whispers now, low and melodic, threading through the coffin's seams, brushing her ears with messages she could not yet decipher. The currents themselves seemed to push and pull with intention, guiding the coffin along an invisible path, though the logic of survival seemed impossible. Even in the darkest moments, the world beyond her prison offered subtle hints that she was not entirely forsaken. Time lost all meaning as the coffin drifted, buffeted by the angry sea. Hours, or perhaps minutes, passed in a blur of darkness, punctuated by the sound of waves crashing and the occasional cry of a distant seabird. Amara's body cramped from the confined space, her hands raw from desperate clawing at the walls. Her breaths came in shallow, uneven gasps, the salty air filling her lungs with a sting that burned like fire. The small glimmers of light beneath the waves danced and shifted, as if the ocean itself were trying to convey a message, that the cruelty of men could not extinguish the life of one chosen by forces greater than themselves. Even as exhaustion threatened to claim her, a fragile thread of hope persisted. The water around the coffin glowed brighter at intervals, currents shifted subtly in her favor, and the wind carried a faint, guiding melody that reminded her she was still part of a larger, living world. Her mind, though frayed by fear, began to focus not on despair but on survival. She could hear the faint murmur of the waves, a voice that promised that her story was not yet over, that the injustice wrought against her would not go unanswered. The coffin continued its journey across the restless sea, each movement a terrifying dance with death, each jolt a test of her resilience, and yet, in this impossible situation, the first seeds of her eventual escape and transformation were quietly taking root. The night stretched endlessly, a mixture of dread, icy water, and supernatural murmurs, leaving Amara trapped between the cruelty of men and the living, watching sea. Every second felt eternal, the boundary between life and death narrowing to the width of the coffin walls. And though hope seemed fragile and fleeting, the subtle signs, the glowing water, the whispering winds, the spirits unseen, hinted that fate itself had not abandoned her. The waves, vast and unknowable, were alive, carrying her not just toward doom, but toward the possibility of survival, a future that no human betrayal could ultimately take from her. The night deepened, and the coffin drifted further from the shore, rocking and jolting with every gust of wind and surge of the tide. The sea, which had appeared indifferent at first, began to reveal a consciousness that surpassed human understanding. Currents swirled with purpose, almost as if unseen hands were guiding the coffin along a path not meant for destruction but for transformation. Small lights danced beneath the surface, like lanterns floating in the inky blackness, illuminating shapes that defied description. The glow shifted and pulsed rhythmically, sending flickers of hope into Amara's heart, a signal that she was not alone. The ocean itself seemed to sense the injustice inflicted upon her, its vast expanse rising and falling in anger, then calming in gentle reassurance as though acknowledging her innocence. From beneath the waves, creatures emerged, not the ordinary fish and crustaceans of the coastal waters, but beings that shimmered with an ethereal brilliance. Some moved in long, serpentine undulations, their scales reflecting the faint light like living jewels. Others swam in groups, creating patterns in the water that seemed to form symbols, an ancient language she could not yet comprehend but somehow understood at the deepest level of her being. These beings guided the coffin away from rocks and treacherous currents, nudging it toward a course that would ensure her survival. The waves themselves became instruments of protection, rolling high to keep predators at bay, then settling into calm troughs to cradle her, as if the ocean had decided she was too precious to be lost. Amara, trapped within the coffin, felt the subtle shift in her own spirit. Fear, which had once been all-consuming, began to give way to a clarity born of survival. She realized that the sea was not her enemy, it was a living force that recognized her suffering and had chosen to intervene. The terror that had gripped her chest loosened, replaced by a fiery resolve. Anger surged within her, sharp and invigorating, directed not at the sea, which protected her, but at those who had betrayed her. She clenched her fists against the lid of the coffin, her spirit coiling like a spring, ready to leap into action when the moment came. Desperation transformed into resilience, and the small flickers of light beneath the waves mirrored the awakening of strength within her own heart. The sea's mood shifted like a living tapestry. Moments of anger saw waves rising higher, swirling and churning with a force that seemed intended to terrify any who would dare interfere. Then, in gentle counterbalance, the currents softened, lapping at the coffin with tender persistence, cradling her as if the ocean itself were a parent soothing a frightened child. The wind, too, played a part, carrying whispers through the tiny seams of the coffin, phrases unintelligible yet comforting, guiding her spirit toward hope. At times, the ocean roared, and the coffin lifted upon towering waves as if it were part of a ritual only the water understood, and Amara, in the darkness, felt a strange sense of awe mixed with fear, sensing that she was part of a larger world, one where injustice could not go unchallenged. In these long, trembling hours, Amara began to understand the power of the sea and its role in her life. Water, she realized, was more than a physical element, it was a force of rebirth, cleansing, and restoration. Each wave that rocked her coffin seemed to wash away the fear that had threatened to consume her, leaving clarity in its place. The salt of the ocean filled her senses, bracing and sharp, and with each breath, it seemed as though the waters were removing the bitterness of betrayal, replacing it with a sense of purpose. The darkness that had once felt suffocating now became a cocoon, a space in which she could transform and emerge stronger than before. Her mind, once clouded by confusion and despair, now began to form strategies for survival. She imagined the steps she might take if freed from her prison, the careful planning of how to confront those who had wronged her. But even as these thoughts took shape, she recognized that the sea's intervention was more than a path to revenge. It was a chance to be renewed, to embrace a new identity forged in the crucible of suffering and supported by forces beyond the mortal realm. The very waves that had threatened her life now became agents of resurrection, preparing her for a destiny she had never imagined. Mystical signs continued to surround her. Glowing currents traced invisible lines beneath the coffin, shifting and curving as though drawing a map only she could follow. The wind carried gentle sighs, soft as the hum of a lullaby, urging patience, resilience, and trust in the unseen. At times, the surface of the water shimmered with images of what might come, visions of herself standing tall, her betrayers trembling before the consequences of their actions. Though she could not yet act, she felt the first stirrings of empowerment, a sense that she was no longer merely a victim but a participant in a cosmic plan, chosen by the elements themselves to endure, to survive, and to return transformed. Hours stretched like an endless tapestry, each moment a test of endurance, yet the sea never abandoned her. Currents shifted with intelligence, guiding her coffin away from danger, while the luminous creatures beneath continued to swim in patterns that seemed protective, deliberate, and almost ritualistic. In the darkness, Amara's fear became a distant echo, replaced by awe, clarity, and a budding strength. The betrayal that had once seemed absolute no longer defined her. The sea's intervention signaled a turning point, a crossing from vulnerability to resilience, from despair to determination. She was being reborn, carried by waters that cleansed her of fear, infused her with courage, and prepared her for the life she would reclaim beyond this watery prison. And as the first hints of dawn colored the horizon, the sea seemed to settle, a quiet yet palpable promise that its intervention was not over but ongoing. The waves lapped with a gentleness that contrasted with their earlier fury, and the whispers of wind and water suggested that Amara's story was far from finished. In the vast, living expanse of the ocean, a young woman once betrayed by her own kin now began to rise in spirit, ready for the transformation that would soon emerge, guided and protected by the mysterious, unyielding power of the sea. The coffin, guided by the restless currents and unseen hands of the sea, eventually began to drift toward a faint glow on the horizon. Hours, perhaps days, though time had lost its meaning, passed in the suffocating darkness, each moment testing the limits of Amara's endurance. Then, as the first faint light of dawn broke through the night, she felt a subtle shift. The coffin lifted more easily on the waves, rocked gently rather than violently, and nudged closer to a shape that emerged through the morning mist. A shore, unlike the familiar sands of her village, appeared, a place of strange trees with silver leaves, rocks that glimmered faintly under the rising sun, and waters that glowed with the remnants of the sea's protective magic. The ocean seemed to slow, as if gently depositing her where she was meant to awaken. With the strength she had barely known she possessed, Amara forced herself to push against the coffin's walls, her muscles trembling from confinement and exhaustion. Every movement felt monumental, each breath a battle against the tight darkness that had confined her for what seemed like an eternity. She forced the lid slightly open and felt the chill of the morning air brush her face, carrying the scent of salt, earth, and something wild and untouched. Trembling, she pushed harder, and the lid gave way just enough to allow her body to slip out into the shallow, glowing waters. The cold wrapped around her like a cloak, shocking her system, but she clung to it, letting the waves buoy her fragile form toward the shore. Each step through the soft, strange sand was agony and relief intertwined, her legs weak, her body aching, yet the exhilaration of freedom ignited a spark deep within her. When she finally collapsed onto the mysterious beach, gasping for breath, the reality of survival hit her fully. Her clothes were torn and soaked, the wood of the coffin still clinging to her in splintered fragments. Salt water stung her eyes and skin, and exhaustion pressed her into the sand as though the earth itself wished to embrace her and hold her close. She lay there for long moments, staring at the strange, shimmering horizon, feeling the warmth of the sun and the gentle rocking of the tide beneath her. The isolation of the island was profound, yet instead of fear, she felt a growing reverence and awe. She had survived what no one should have survived, and the living, breathing world around her seemed to acknowledge it, welcoming her with whispers of wind and the soft shimmer of water that seemed almost sentient. As she rose, still trembling and weak, Amara's mind turned inward. Thoughts of betrayal surged, sharp and bitter, piercing the awe that surrounded her. How could those she loved, those she had trusted implicitly, commit such cruelty? Her heart ached with grief, her chest tight with the sting of injustice, yet the anger that flared was not a destructive force. Instead it fueled clarity. She would not remain a victim. She would reclaim her life, confront those who had wronged her, and ensure that justice, whether by human means or the unseen forces that had guided her, would prevail. The betrayal had marked her, but it would not define her. From the depths of despair, a determination had grown, rooted in the knowledge that the sea had chosen her for more than mere survival. As she began to explore the island, she became aware of subtle changes within herself, gifts awakened by the ordeal she had endured. Her senses felt heightened. She could hear the soft rustle of leaves and the quietest movements of the waves, as if the world itself had amplified its whispers just for her. The scent of the sea lingered in her nostrils, carrying with it faint hints of currents far beyond the horizon. She could almost sense the approach of creatures before they appeared, feel the shifts in wind and water, and intuitively understand the patterns of the land she had never seen before. This newfound awareness felt natural, as though it had always been part of her, waiting for the ordeal to unlock it. The sense of connectedness to the world, the land, the sea, the skies, was intoxicating, a subtle confirmation that her survival was part of something larger, something sacred. Amara spent hours, perhaps the rest of the morning, on the island, letting her body rest while her mind processed the enormity of what had transpired. She touched the sand, felt the waters lap against her feet, and let herself acknowledge the fear, despair, and grief she had endured. Tears flowed freely, not of weakness but of release, of recognition that she had passed through a trial from which few could emerge intact. The injustice she had suffered was sharp, but now, tempered by survival and guided by the mystical currents that had watched over her, it became fuel for purpose rather than despair. By midday, Amara had begun to walk the island, her movements cautious yet deliberate. She tested her strength, discovering muscles she had forgotten she possessed, endurance she had not realized was hers. Each step reinforced her resolve, and each glance at the shimmering waters reminded her that she had allies beyond the human realm, forces that would aid her in ways she could not yet fully comprehend. The betrayal that had seemed absolute no longer held sway. In its place grew a quiet, simmering power, an understanding that the ordeal had changed her fundamentally. She was no longer merely the kind, trusting girl of her village. She was something stronger, something attuned to the rhythms of the natural and supernatural world alike. As she sat on a sun-warmed rock, gazing at the horizon where the ocean met the sky, Amara made a silent vow. She would return, not as the vulnerable girl cast aside, but as a force that could command respect and fear alike. She would confront those who had wronged her, and she would do so armed not just with human cunning, but with the gifts awakened by the sea: intuition, resilience, and a deep connection to the forces that governed life and justice. Her heart no longer trembled with uncertainty, it pulsed with purpose. From the coffin to the waves, from despair to awakening, she had emerged not merely alive, but transformed, reborn by water and trial, ready to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. Amara stood at the edge of a cliff overlooking the village, the wind whipping her hair across her face, carrying the salty tang of the sea she had once been cast into. Below, the coastal settlement lay bathed in early morning light, unaware that the girl they had betrayed was no longer the same. Every detail of the village, the huts, the market paths, the shoreline where she had been abandoned, was etched in her memory. She had walked the forests, conversed with spirits, and felt the pulse of the sea guiding her. Now she understood that revenge would require more than anger. It would demand cunning, strategy, and the precise orchestration of both mortal and mystical forces. Her plan began with patience. She would not rush blindly into confrontation. The betrayals she had endured were steeped in greed and arrogance, and these traits would be her allies. She observed her enemies from a distance, noting their routines, the way they spoke to one another, and the moments when their guard was lowest. Mara, her jealous sister, moved with a sharp, brittle energy, constantly preoccupied with appearances. Their father, whose greed had driven him to betray his own daughter, spent long hours counting coins and dealing with neighbors, his mind blind to the dangers creeping ever closer. Elder Oba, the manipulative village elder, strutted with confidence, believing himself untouchable, his aura of power masking the fear that had begun to settle in the fringes of his consciousness. Amara's allies, both mystical and mortal, became crucial elements of her strategy. Birds of the forest acted as scouts, their eyes and ears watching from above, reporting back with subtle chirps and fluttering movements. The luminescent creatures of the sea lingered in tidal pools near the shore, their presence unnoticed by humans but capable of creating illusions and disturbances in the water when needed. Forest spirits whispered guidance on hidden pathways, ways to approach the village without detection, and methods to manipulate the natural elements around her. Even the animals of the island, from foxes to deer, became part of her plan, signaling changes in her environment and preparing subtle distractions to unsettle her enemies. The symbolism of the natural world began to mirror her growing intent. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, dark and low, moving with a sense of inevitability that paralleled the justice she sought. The waves, once gentle carriers of her survival, now rose with a restless energy, crashing against the rocks below the cliff in a constant rhythm that reminded her of the fury lying just beneath her composed exterior. Birds circled above in strange patterns, their flight shifting with the wind, while the foxes and other forest animals moved with a careful, deliberate grace. Every element of nature seemed attuned to her purpose, ready to play a part in the reckoning that would soon unfold. Amara mapped her plan with meticulous care. She would first test the reactions of her betrayers, introducing subtle disturbances and inexplicable signs that hinted at consequences without revealing her full hand. Cracked bowls of water mysteriously tipped over, small fires flickering in abandoned huts, whispers on the wind that suggested eyes watching from the shadows. These minor provocations were designed to unsettle them, to plant seeds of fear, and to demonstrate that forces beyond their understanding were already at work. They would feel the first tremors of justice before the true reckoning arrived. In parallel, Amara began to strengthen her mystical connection. Her intuition, honed by the ordeal in the coffin and guided by her allies, allowed her to sense shifts in the energy of the village. She could predict when Mara would leave the house, when her father's greed would draw him away from the safety of his home, and when Elder Oba would convene his council. These insights were crucial, for her plan relied on timing, misdirection, and the element of surprise. Each move was calculated, every pause deliberate. She understood that patience was her greatest weapon, and that the longer she allowed her enemies to grow complacent, the more devastating the consequences would be. The sea itself provided a living arsenal. Waves could be summoned to disrupt boats, tides could shift to expose hidden threats, and the glowing creatures beneath the water offered subtle forms of illumination and distraction. Forest spirits could alter the paths of travelers, create illusions of movement, and obscure Amara's approach until the moment of confrontation. Even the animals acted as silent agents, their presence a warning and a distraction, reinforcing the idea that the natural world had aligned itself with her. The plan was not one of brute force. It was a symphony of subtle manipulations, psychological pressure, and the judicious use of mystical intervention. As the days passed, Amara rehearsed the sequence of events in her mind, envisioning every reaction, every misstep, and every eventual triumph. Her intelligence and patience became as sharp as a blade, her awareness heightened by the gifts awakened during her survival. She recognized that revenge was not only about punishing her betrayers but also about reclaiming her power and demonstrating that cruelty and treachery would not go unanswered. The storm clouds above mirrored her growing focus, the restless waves echoed her determination, and the subtle signs in the animal kingdom reminded her that she was never truly alone in her quest. By the time she finally moved closer to the village, the tension was palpable, even from afar. Small, seemingly innocuous events began to unfold. Waves lapped higher against the shoreline than usual, birds cawed sharply and scattered without explanation, and the foxes watched from the forest's edge with eyes that seemed almost human in their understanding. The villagers, oblivious to the intricate web being woven around them, began to feel unease, a subtle whisper of dread carried on the wind. Amara, standing at a safe distance, felt the surge of power within her, a combination of human intelligence, patience, and the supernatural forces that had chosen to guide her. Her plan was set in motion, each piece aligned, every potential outcome considered, and the reckoning she had dreamed of in the coffin and on the waves was now within reach. Amara returned to the village at dusk, moving with a quiet but commanding presence. The once familiar paths now felt strange, illuminated by the last golden rays of the sun and the subtle glow of the mystical creatures that followed her. She paused at the edge of the shoreline, letting her gaze sweep over the huts, the market square, and the family home where betrayal had been orchestrated. Her heart, once heavy with grief, now pulsed with determination. Every step forward carried the weight of the sea's power and the spirits that had guided her through survival, giving her confidence that she was no longer alone in this reckoning. As she approached the village, her enemies, Mara, her father, and Elder Oba, emerged from their homes, drawn by strange noises. The crash of waves against rocks even at low tide, flickers of light dancing on the water, and the rustling of leaves as if the forest itself were whispering warnings. Their eyes widened in disbelief, and a murmur ran through the small crowd that had gathered. The girl they had left for dead had returned, her appearance ethereal, almost otherworldly. Her hair glimmered faintly under the dim light, and a strange aura surrounded her, a subtle shimmer in the air that made the hairs on their necks stand. They stepped back, instinctively sensing the power she now carried. The first signs of supernatural intervention were subtle but terrifying. Waves began to crash higher along the shore, despite the calmness of the tide. Glowing forms emerged in the water, small, undulating shapes that moved like living lanterns, illuminating the darkening beach with an unearthly light. Birds that had once sung gently now cawed loudly, circling the village in frantic patterns, while foxes and forest creatures emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with intelligence and warning. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that seemed to echo the sins of those who had wronged her. Mara's hands trembled as she clutched at her skirt, while her father staggered back, his greed and pride stripped away by the sheer weight of fear. Elder Oba's confident posture wavered as the shadows seemed to twist around him, mirroring the twisting guilt he had ignored for so long. Amara's voice, calm yet commanding, broke the tense silence. "Do you recognize me?" she asked, stepping forward, her eyes locking on each of her betrayers. The tremor in her tone was subtle, but it carried authority, the weight of survival and the backing of unseen forces. "The sea has witnessed your cruelty. The spirits have carried me here, not to plead, but to ensure that justice is served." Her words hung in the air, sharp as blades, as the villagers around them shivered, sensing the shift from mortal dispute to a confrontation charged with supernatural energy. The waves responded almost immediately, surging higher, crashing against the rocks and flooding the shore in a controlled fury, as if the ocean itself were delivering punishment. Water spirits rose and twirled, their forms glowing with blue and silver light, creating illusions of danger and forcing the betrayers to stumble backward in fear. The wind whistled through the village, carrying distant cries that sounded eerily like voices from beyond the grave, echoing the injustice they had committed. Mara clutched her chest, her mind racing with panic, while her father's knees buckled, and Elder Oba's face paled as he realized the full scope of their reckoning. Amara moved closer, each step deliberate, guided by the rhythm of the waves and the subtle nudges of her allies. "You left me for death," she said, her voice soft but unwavering. "And yet, here I stand, not because of your mercy but because forces you cannot command chose to protect me. Know this, the sea and its spirits are patient, but their justice is inevitable." The tension was palpable, every sound, the roar of the surf, the rustle of the forest, the frantic cries of birds, reinforced the sense of dread that gripped her enemies. They could not run, they could not plead, and they could not deny the power that now stood before them in the form of the girl they had tried to destroy. As the confrontation reached its peak, waves crashed violently, water spiraling like serpents toward the guilty. Spirits emerged from the foam, their luminous forms encircling Mara, her father, and Elder Oba, forcing them to witness visions of their betrayal and its consequences. The villagers, witnessing this supernatural display, gasped in awe and fear, recognizing that the sea itself had become an agent of justice, and that Amara's survival was no mere chance, but a declaration that no cruelty would go unpunished.